You're an Eldar hybrid, cloned and reborn hundreds of times. Each iteration ends the same way. You kill yourself. Not because you want to die, but because what you've heard, what you've been told in those quiet chambers beneath the Imperial Palace is so horrifying that death becomes the only mercy. The secrets you carry aren't just dark, they're soul-crushing, reality-breaking, the kinds of truths that make you understand why ignorance really is bliss. That was Ael Wyntor's existence, hundreds of times over, and the man who kept bringing him back, who kept confessing these terrible secrets like they were casual dinner conversation. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand, the architect of the Imperium, the most trusted human in the galaxy. So let me ask you this. What could possibly be so terrible that an Eldar consciousness, beings who remember the fall, who know what true horror looks like, would choose oblivion over living with that knowledge? And more importantly, what does it mean that Malcador needed someone to tell? That even he, with all his power and centuries of experience, couldn't carry these secrets alone. Because we know what Malcador actually said. The Horus Heresy wasn't an accident. It wasn't chaos corruption that got out of hand. It was the plan all along. The Primarchs were engineered to turn on each other. Every rivalry, every slight, every moment of the Emperor's supposed favoritism was manipulation. Positioning pieces on a game board. And we, all of us, the entire Imperium, have been living in the aftermath of a controlled demolition that somehow went wrong. But was it really Malcador and the Emperor together, or was there only ever one true architect of humanity's fate? We need to talk about what Malcador told Sibel Niasta, a dying astropath who had served him for centuries. This is from the audio drama Malcador, First Lord of the Imperium, and it's one of those moments where everything you thought you knew gets flipped on its head. Sibel's dying. She's terrified that the war has spiraled beyond control, that all their work will be for nothing. She's watching the Imperium tear itself apart and wondering if the Primarchs have doomed humanity. And what does Malcador tell her? That the Primarchs were always meant to be temporary, tools for the Great Crusade, nothing more. Like the Thunder Warriors before them, burning bright but meant to burn out. The Imperium wasn't being built for post-humans, it was being built for regular humanity. And the only way to control beings as powerful and dangerous as the Primarchs was to engineer their own destruction. Give them a lifespan that had nothing to do with biology and everything to do with orchestrated betrayal. Malcador laid it out plain. This was always intended to be the final act of the crusade. We wanted the Primarchs to turn against one another, against their father. Every rivalry, every slight, every time the Emperor seemed to favor one son over another, it was deliberate, pitting them against each other like pieces on a chops board. Some Primarchs couldn't be managed, couldn't be controlled, so they were never meant to reach the endgame. The lost Primarchs? Maybe they figured it out too early. Maybe they were the first test runs of the purge to come. This is where it gets worse. Malcador admits their failure wasn't in the plan itself, but in underestimating chaos. The ruinous powers emboldened their champions among the 18, and the war started before they were ready, before they could properly control which Primarchs fell and which remained. The sound was planned. The execution got hijacked. Now you might be thinking, this is just Malcador comforting a dying woman, telling her what she needs to hear so she can pass in peace. And honestly, that's possible. Malcador himself frames it that way, calling it one of his agreed-upon lies. But think about this. When someone tells you they're lying and then proceeds to give you incredibly specific details about that lie, you have to wonder if the real deception is pretending it's a lie at all. Because everything Malcador describes, the manipulation, the engineering of rivalries, the controlled demolition, it all fits too perfectly with what we see throughout the heresy. And then there's the moment that really gets me. After Sibel dies, after Malcador has held her hand and lied to comfort her passing, he watches the sun rise. And he says something that cuts right through all the political maneuvering, all the grand strategy, all the justified atrocities. I lie to them to spare their sorrow, even as I envy their mortality, and it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. A being who's lived 6,700 years, who's seen empires rise and fall, who's engineered the deaths of demigods, envying the mortality of the humans he claims to serve. Not just envying it, but breaking over it, because he has to keep living with what he's done. He can't escape into death the way Sibel just did. He has to carry the weight of every manipulation, every betrayal, every calculated sacrifice for millennia to come. It doesn't sound like Malcador believes his lies are justified. It sounds more like someone who knows exactly what they are and can't stop being it. But Sibel wasn't the only person Malcador confided in. There was Ael Wyntor, and what happened to Wyntor shows you who Malcador truly is. During the Great Crusade, Malcador found a dying Eldar in the webway. Being Malcador, he didn't waste the opportunity. He stripped the alien consciousness from the corpse and merged it with human biology, creating a hybrid being, Wyntor. And Wyntor became Malcador's confidant, his confessor, the one person, or person adjacent, that Malcador could speak to without his mask. At first, Wyntor enjoyed these conversations. Malcador was learned, compelling, had access to incredible art and literature. They'd play regicide, drink amasec, discuss things that couldn't be discussed elsewhere. But looking back, Wyntor realized it was a trap, an elegant, gilded trap, just another one of Malcador's schemes. Because Malcador needed to confess, he needed a voice that wasn't an echo of his own. Someone he could tell about all the secrets and horrible truths about this war and all the ones to come afterwards. The weight of what Malcador carried was so immense that even he, the most powerful psyker in the galaxy after the Emperor and Magnus, couldn't bear it alone. And what did those confessions do to Wyntor? They drove him to suicide over and over again, hundreds of times. An Eldar consciousness, a species that has seen the fall, that lives with the constant knowledge that Slaanesh is waiting to devour their souls, and has witnessed horrors humans can barely comprehend, found Malcador's secrets so unbearable that death was preferable. Not once or twice, but hundreds of times. Each time Wyntor killed himself, Malcador would just make another one. Slice off a piece, grow a new clone, start the process over. A copy of a copy of a copy. Degrading, Malcador said. Each iteration lasted a shorter time before the weight of knowledge became too much, and Wyntor sought oblivion again. Something else. Wyntor wasn't just Malcador's confessor. He had a practical purpose too. When Malcador needed to hide the Grey Knight's base on Titan, hide an entire moon from Horus and the forces of chaos, it was Wyntor who helped. This Eldar-human hybrid, with his unique connection to both species' psychic traditions, helped Malcador work the mystical means to hide Titan away in the warp itself. Protected by macro Geller fields and sigillic rites where the final battles of the heresy played out in real space. So Malcador didn't just torture this being for emotional comfort. He used him. Used his unique nature, his hybrid consciousness, for one of the most important magical workings of the entire heresy. And then kept him around to confess to until the copies degraded so much they couldn't be sustained anymore. When Wyntor finally discovered the truth, found the capsule with the original Eldar corpse, realized he was a manufactured being designed to be Malcador's dumping ground for guilt and secrets, he confronted the Sigillite. And what was Malcador's response? I regret it, but my need was greater than yours. That's it. An acknowledgement of the horrific violation he'd committed, paired with a justification that his burden mattered more. Even the keeper of Terra's secrets couldn't carry his duty alone. So he created a being specifically to torture with knowledge, over and over again, because he needed to confide. Now this is the question that should be keeping you up at night. What exactly was Malcador confessing? What secrets were so terrible that they broke an Eldar hybrid 300 times over? We know from the Sibel confession that at least one of those secrets was the planned nature of the heresy, the deliberate manipulation of the Primarchs, the engineered betrayal. But there's a phrase that Malcador uses that's chilling. All the secrets and horrible truths about this war and all the ones to come afterwards. All the ones to come afterwards. The Horus Heresy wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And Malcador knew what was coming. The 10,000 years of suffering, the slow decay, the Imperium eating itself alive, the Emperor trapped on the Golden Throne, barely holding back chaos while humanity pounds its collective head against the wall of extinction. Was that part of the plan too, or was it the consequence of their failure, their inability to properly execute the Primarch Purge before chaos interfered? Either way, Malcador knew, and the knowledge of what was coming, what they'd set in motion, was enough to drive a being to hundreds of suicides. So, who exactly is Malcador? Because Malcador the Sigillite is clearly just a title, another mask in a collection spanning millennia. And according to Jaghatai Khan, who got this information from Horus, Malcador's real name is Brahm al-Khadour, the Cursed Wanderer, a Perpetual, last of the Sigillites, an ancient order that sought to gather and preserve humanity's greatest and most powerful artifacts. And during Old Night, Brahm al-Khadour committed atrocities. The Khan is pretty clear about this. What you have done, the atrocities that you and your secret order heaped upon mankind during Old Night. Now Malcador doesn't confirm or deny any of this when confronted. He just sort of accepts it. Gets ready for possible combat, considering whether he still has the psychic strength to subdue a Primarch. But he never says, "That's not who I am." He never defends himself, and at the end of the story he tells the Khan something interesting. Because I have to be able to believe, when all else is done, that should they so wish, even the greatest monsters of our time can yet be redeemed and forgiven. Is he talking about the traitor Primarchs? Maybe. But that phrasing, even the greatest monsters of our time, it reads like somebody talking about themselves, like someone who knows they're a monster trying to convince themselves that redemption is possible. During Old Night, when humanity was fragmented and terrified, when psychers were emerging without training and ripping holes in reality, when Xenos were picking at the corpse of human civilization, someone had to start making hard choices. Someone had to do terrible things to preserve what artifacts and knowledge remained, and the Sigillites took that burden. Consider what it means to survive 6,700 years by the time of the heresy. You don't make it that long by being nice. You don't preserve humanity through compassion and understanding. You make brutal calculations. You sacrifice millions to save billions. You become exactly the kind of monster that people tell horror stories about. But then when you meet another immortal with a vision, someone who wants to unite humanity, who has the power and will to actually do it, you sign on. Not because you suddenly become good, but because you see an opportunity, a chance to turn all those millennia of suffering and atrocity into something meaningful, something that might justify what you've done. Malcador met the Emperor when he was just another Terran warlord, and it was Malcador who recommended he take the title Emperor. That detail is interesting, right? The Emperor wasn't planning to call himself that. Malcador suggested it. Malcador, who had spent thousands of years learning how to manipulate humans, how to manage catastrophes, how to make the terrible choices that leaders shy away from. So when did Malcador's redemption arc start? When he met the Emperor? Or has there never been a redemption arc at all? Just an evolution of methods. Same monster, bigger chessboard. Something that doesn't get talked about enough. Malcador wasn't just the First Lord of Terra, the founder of the Administratum, the Emperor's advisor. He was also the Grand Master of Assassins. The man who controlled the Imperium's entire administrative apparatus also controlled its capacity for targeted killing. Every Officio Assassinorum temple, Vindicare snipers, Eversor berserkers, Calidus shapeshifters, Calexis anti-psyker blanks, all of them answered to Malcador. He literally held the power of life and death over anyone in the Imperium. And he used it. During the heresy, Malcador dispatched multiple assassination attempts against Horus. Not just one or two, multiple teams. He even sent the first ever execution force, a combined team of assassins from different temples working together, something so dangerous it had never been tried before. Several of these teams came close, really close, but none succeeded. Eventually, the Emperor himself ordered Malcador to stop. No more assassination attempts, they had to let it play out. This creates a problem in the context of Malcador's confession to Sibel. If the heresy was always meant to happen, if the Primarchs were engineered to turn on each other, why was Malcador trying so hard to kill Horus? Option 1, the confession was a lie, and Malcador really was desperately trying to stop the heresy any way he could. Option 2, the plan was for a controlled purge of specific Primarchs, but when chaos pushed early and Horus turned, Malcador tried to salvage the situation by removing the traitor figurehead. Keep the civil war contained. prevent it from becoming the galaxy-spanning catastrophe it became. Option 3, and this one is the darkest one. The assassination attempts were never meant to succeed. They were theater, a way to make it look like the Imperium was fighting back with everything it had, when really Malcador knew they'd fail, because if Horus died too early, before the full purge of unstable Primarchs could occur, the whole plan falls apart. But you can't just let your greatest enemy run wild without opposition. That would be suspicious. So you send assassins you know will fail, and when they do, you've maintained the appearance of fighting while actually letting the plan succeed. That third option is as Malcador as it gets. The man who creates an Eldar hybrid just to have someone to confess to. The man who engineers a civil war among demigods. The man who understands that the most convincing lies are the ones where you appear to be fighting against the very thing you secretly want to happen. The Grand Master of Assassins, the architect of death itself, and every death in the Imperium, from the lowliest heretic to the mightiest Primarch, happened because Malcador allowed it to happen. Consider what Malcador's confession to Sibel actually means in practical terms, because if we take him at his word that the heresy was planned, that the Primarchs were being manipulated from the moment of their rediscovery, then everything we know about the Great Crusade looks different. Angron was left with butcher nails in his skull. The Emperor told him removing them would kill him because they'd integrated too deeply into brain tissue. But for being with the Emperor's power, the master of genetic engineering who created the Primarchs in the first place, leaving Angron broken and unstable, a ticking time bomb of rage, that's a choice. An angry, unstable Primarch is easier to position as a piece you're willing to sacrifice. Someone the other Primarchs won't mourn too deeply when he turns. Mortarion hated Psychers. It was his defining trauma from Barbarous. The Emperor knew this and yet brought him into every project requiring massive psychic manipulation of webway access without ever explaining why it was necessary. Set him up to feel betrayed when the truth came out. When Mortarion discovered his father was building something he considered sorcery on a scale that dwarfed anything the Tyrant of Barbarous had done, it wasn't surprising he fell. It was inevitable, exactly as designed. Lorgar was looking for meaning, for purpose beyond just conquest. The Emperor knew this, Malcador knew this, and instead of redirecting that need, they humiliated him at Monarchia, forced him to his knees in front of his own burning city while Guilliman's legion stood witness. Malcador was there, took Lorgar's rage, a slap that sent him flying 20 meters through the air, and got back up. He was seemingly deliberately breaking Lorgar to see what he'll become. Magnus was told to stop using psychic powers, told that sorcery wasn't dangerous, and then watched as the Emperor vanished to work on the biggest psychic project in human history, the Webway. When Magnus tried to warn his father about Horus's betrayal, he accidentally destroyed the very project he didn't know existed. Perfect setup for a tragedy that pushes him towards chaos. And who did Magnus confront beneath the Imperial Palace during the siege? Malcador. The Sigillite tried to turn him, tried to use the lost shard of Magnus' soul, now implanted in Janus, the first Supreme Grand Master of the Grey Knights, as leverage. Magnus, in rage, seemingly killed Malcador right there. But Malcador didn't stay dead. Olivia Sarica, a Perpetual who had been with them, regenerated from her own wounds and transferred her life essence to restore the Sigillite. She sacrificed herself completely to bring him back. Another death for Malcador's continued existence. Another person paying the price for the Keeper of Terra's secrets to survive. And Malcador carried the despair of her sacrifice for the rest of his days. The pattern holds. People keep dying so Malcador can continue his work. Perturabo was given the worst assignments, the grinding sieges, the thankless garrison duties, never any recognition or glory, just constant work while his brothers got the parades. You don't treat your favorite attack dog that way unless you're deliberately breeding resentment. And Horus? Golden Boy Horus, who was given more favor and attention than anyone else. He was set up as the keystone, the one whose fall would drag half the Primarchs with him. Because Horus had relationships, had influence, had legitimacy. If you want to engineer a civil war that splits your forces roughly in half, you don't turn a loner like Korax. You turn the one that everyone respects. This is what Malcador meant by positioning pieces on a chops board. Every Primarch's discovery, every assignment, every moment of the Emperor's favoritism or neglect, it was part of his plan. Not just to win the Great Crusade, but to set up the conditions for exactly the kind of civil war we got. Which gets worse. Malcador says their failure was that Chaos intervened before they were ready. The ruinous powers emboldened their champions among the 18, before Malcador and the Emperor could properly control who fell and who stayed loyal. Which means the plan wasn't for Horus to lead the traitors. It wasn't for the heresy to be this close, this devastating. They wanted a controlled purge. Remove the Primarchs who couldn't be managed. Probably ones like Angron, Kurz, maybe Mortarion, while keeping the stable, controllable ones like Guilliman and Dorn. Let humanity emerge as the rulers of the galaxy, with any remaining Primarchs as carefully managed guardians rather than potential tyrants. But Chaos sensed what was happening, saw the manipulation, and instead of letting the Emperor execute his plan cleanly, they pushed early and hard. Turned Lorgar, corrupted Horus, brought half of the legions into open rebellion before the Emperor could winnow them down gradually. The Horus Heresy was Chaos hijacking the Emperor's already corrupt plan and making it worse. Two monsters fighting over the same chessboard, with humanity as the pieces being sacrificed. Throughout all of this, there's a question that keeps nagging. Whose plan was this really? Malcador presents it as a joint effort. The Emperor and I, he says, but look at the pattern of the relationship. Malcador met the Emperor when he was just another warlord. Malcador suggested he take the title Emperor. Malcador founded the Administratum. Malcador managed Terra while the Emperor was off crusading. Malcador founded the Inquisition. Malcador selected the first Grey Knights. Malcador manipulated the Primarchs. Malcador controlled the Assassins. The Emperor's great at the big stuff. Psychic mastery, genetic engineering, military strategy. But the subtle manipulation, the long-term political maneuvering, the morally questionable choices that keep an empire running, that's always been Malcador's domain. There's a scene where Malcador easily incapacitates Horus with his psychic abilities, just shuts down a Primarch like flipping a switch when Horus tries to mention one of the lost Primarchs. The description says he reverted to a deep dark rage complete with a rictus grin that was described as an older familiar rage. An older rage. Like this is who Malcador really is underneath the frail old man act. What if the Emperor isn't actually the mastermind? What if he's the weapon and Malcador's been wielding him the entire time? The Emperor is powerful, visionary, but he makes terrible interpersonal decisions. He's awful at understanding his sons. He abandoned the Great Crusade right at its climax to work on a secret project he doesn't explain to anyone. He treats his Primarchs like tools rather than sons, which is exactly what they're designed to be, but terrible strategy if you want their loyalty. But Malcador? Malcador understands people. He knows how to manipulate, how to position, how to make the hard choices. He's been doing it for thousands of years, longer than the Emperor's been a public figure. The Emperor might believe the Imperium is for humanity, but who told him that? Who shaped that vision? Who suggested the title Emperor in the first place? Malcador. It's always Malcador. Consider the possibility. What if the Emperor's imprisonment on the Golden Throne was part of Malcador's plan all along? Malcador tells Sibel that the original plan for the Golden Throne was Magnus. When that fell through, Malcador took his place, but only temporarily. The Emperor ended up there permanently after the fight with Horus. But what if that was always the intended destination? Create a situation where the Emperor has to fight Horus, ensure the fight is devastating enough that the Emperor needs the throne to survive. And suddenly you've got the most powerful psyker in human history trapped in a chair for 10,000 years. Can't interfere with policy anymore. Can't make those terrible interpersonal decisions. Can't decide on a whim to abandon projects or neglect his sons. Just sits there, burning 1,000 psychers a day, holding back chaos while humanity does whatever the people actually running the Imperium want to do. And who set up the structures that have run the Imperium for 10,000 years? The Administratum, the Inquisition, the strict hierarchy that keeps humanity grinding forward even without clear leadership. Malcador. Of course it's Malcador. His body turned to dust on the Golden Throne, but he told the Emperor that fragments of himself would live on in both the throne and his chosen. The Inquisition and the Grey Knights. 10,000 years later, the Inquisition still operates on Malcadorian principles. The Grey Knights still follow the structure he established. The Imperium still runs on the systems he created. Malcador the Sigillite died at the Siege of Terra. But did Brahm al-Khadour, or did he just finally complete the greatest manipulation of all, removing the Emperor from active play while ensuring his own immortality through institutions? So, this is where we are. The man who created hundreds of clones just to have someone to confess to. The man whose confessions drove an Eldar consciousness to suicide 300 times. The man who admitted that the Horus Heresy was planned from the beginning. The man who might have been called Brahm al-Khadour and committed atrocities during Old Night. The man who positioned the Emperor's sons like pieces on a board, knowing they were being maneuvered towards mutual destruction. The Grand Master of Assassins who sent kill teams after Horus while simultaneously claiming the Civil War was meant to happen. And the question we're left with isn't whether Malcador was a good person. He clearly wasn't. The question is, was he working with the Emperor or was he using him? Because if you're an immortal who survived 6,700 years by the time of the heresy, you've learned patience. You've learned to think in terms of millennia rather than centuries. You've learned that direct power is less important than institutional power. And you've learned that the best way to control someone isn't to fight them. It's to make them think they're in charge while you quietly shape every decision they make. The Emperor created the Primarchs, but Malcador managed them. The Emperor won the Unification Wars, but Malcador suggested the title and built the government. The Emperor led the Great Crusade, but Malcador stayed home and made sure Terra ran smoothly. The Emperor built the Webway, but Malcador built the Inquisition. The Emperor fought Horus, but Malcador controlled the Assassins. And when it all fell apart, when the heresy came too early and too hard, when half the legions turned traitor and marched on Terra, when the Emperor had to face Horus in single combat and nearly died, Malcador was ready. He'd already built the structures that would keep the Imperium functioning without the Emperor's active guidance. He'd already founded the Inquisition that would hunt heresy in his name. He'd already selected the Grey Knights who would fight demons in his absence. It's almost like he knew it would turn out this way, like he'd planned for exactly this scenario. Now maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Malcador really was the loyal servant he appeared to be. Maybe the confession to Sibel was just a comforting lie. Maybe the manipulation of the Primarchs was genuinely a joint effort with the Emperor. Maybe his death on the Golden Throne was a heroic sacrifice rather than a planned exit. But then I think about Wyntor, about those hundreds of suicides, about what secrets could possibly be so terrible that they'd break an Eldar consciousness that many times. And I think about Malcador's final words to Khan, that even the greatest monsters can be redeemed and forgiven. Was he talking about the traitor Primarchs or himself? About Brahm al-Khadour, the cursed wanderer who committed atrocities during Old Night and spent the next several thousand years trying to convince himself those crimes were justified? About a man who met a warlord with a vision and saw an opportunity not for redemption but for validation, for proof that the terrible things he'd done and was still doing were necessary for humanity's survival. There's a character in some old literature, I think it was Milton, who said it's better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. But Malcador was smarter than that. He understood that the real power isn't ruling or serving. It's being the one who defines what ruling means. Being the one who builds the structures that determines how power flows. The Emperor rules the Imperium, but Malcador built it. And this brings us to the cherry on top. There's a theory floating around, and you may have seen it on this channel, that the Emperor might have been, or could become, something called the Dark King, a god of tyranny and control, born from humanity's desperate need for order at any cost. The counterpart to the Chaos Gods, maybe, but not necessarily better, just different flavors of terrible. But what if we've been looking at the wrong candidate? The Emperor is powerful, sure, he's got the psychic might, the vision, the presence. But he's also got all these weaknesses. He can't relate to his sons. He makes terrible strategic decisions when it comes to people. He gets so focused on one project that he ignores everything else. These aren't the traits of someone who builds a 10,000-year tyranny. But Malcador understands people perfectly. He knows exactly how to manipulate them, how to build institutions that will last, how to make humanity dependent on structures that can't exist without accepting tyranny as the price of survival. He's been doing it for thousands of years, and he's really good at it. What if the Dark King isn't the Emperor at all? What if it's Malcador? Or what if it's the system Malcador created? A tyranny so perfect that it doesn't need a tyrant anymore. Just the idea of one sitting on a golden throne. Think about the Imperium as it exists in the 41st millennium. The Emperor is barely conscious, if he's conscious at all. He can't make decisions, can't issue orders, can't guide policy. But the Imperium keeps grinding forward anyway. The Administratum manages logistics. The Inquisition hunts heresy. The Ecclesiarchy preaches the Imperial Creed, a religion the Emperor explicitly rejected, but one that's proven incredibly effective at control. The machine Malcador built runs perfectly without an operator. And everyone justifies it in the Emperor's name. The Emperor protects, for the Emperor, in his name. But the Emperor's not protecting anything anymore except maybe reality itself from chaos incursion. Everything else, every execution, every purge, every war, every sacrifice, that's the system, Malcador's system. So when we talk about the Dark King, about the entity of absolute tyranny and control, maybe we shouldn't be looking at the Emperor at all. Maybe we should be looking at his right hand, at the man who built the structures, at Brahm al-Khadour, the cursed wanderer, who spent 6,700 years learning exactly how to create a system of oppression so complete that it could run itself. The Emperor is trapped on the golden throne, barely alive, maybe barely aware. But Malcador's legacy, that's thriving. That's what's actually running the Imperium. And it will keep running long after even the idea of the Emperor finally dies. Because Malcador built something that doesn't need faith in a person. It needs faith in the system itself. That's the real horror. Not that the Emperor might become a god of tyranny, but that Malcador already did, and we've been living in his domain for 10,000 years without realizing it. But we need to talk about the end, because for all the darkness, for all the manipulation and atrocity, there's one moment that complicates everything. Malcador's death on the Golden Throne. When the Emperor decided to face Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, he needed someone to take his place on the Golden Throne, to hold the psychic barrier protecting the human-built sections of the webway. Magnus had been the intended replacement, but Magnus had sided with Horus, so Malcador stepped up. And the Emperor, knowing what this would cost, declared that Malcador the Sigillite would now forever be known as Malcador the Hero. The Emperor, who had shown so little sentiment towards his Primarchs, who had treated them as tools and weapons, took the time to rename Malcador before sending him to certain death. Not the Sigillite, not the First Lord, the Hero. Malcador wasn't as powerful as the Emperor, not even close. His psychic abilities were nothing compared to the Master of Mankind's, and everybody knew he couldn't last long on the throne. But he took his place anyway, willingly, knowing he was sacrificing himself for humanity's survival. Upon the throne, Malcador experienced torment beyond description. His body began to dissolve, breaking down under the psychic strain. But he also gained something, a new awareness. For the first time, he saw the universe the way the Emperor had always seen it. The full scope of chaos, the webway of fate, the terrible price of survival. And even as he burned, Horus invaded his mind. The War Master used sorcery to show Malcador the plight of Imperial forces aboard the Vengeful Spirit, trying to break his concentration, trying to make him fail. But Malcador persevered, even reduced to dust, even with his soul barely clinging to existence through sheer will alone. He sent his psychic clues to aid the Imperial heroes making their way to Lupercal's court. By the time the Emperor's broken body was brought back to the throne, Malcador had been reduced to dust, but his soul remained, powering the throne through force of will. And when the Emperor took his place, Malcador finally let go, finally allowed himself to die. His last thoughts? Bidding goodbye to his oldest friend, expressing hope that fragments of himself would live on in both the Golden Throne and his chosen, and acknowledging that the foundations of the Imperium were no longer himself and the Emperor, implying that something new had been built from their sacrifice. So was that the redemption he'd been seeking? The moment when Brahm al-Khadour, the cursed wanderer, the perpetrator of atrocities during the Old Night, finally became Malcador the Hero? When all the manipulation, all the calculated cruelty, all the engineered betrayals led to this, one genuine sacrifice for humanity's survival? Or was it just the final move on the chessboard, the completion of a plan that required Malcador's death to cement his institution's legitimacy? After all, martyrs are more powerful than administrators. A man who died holding back chaos itself becomes legend, and legend shape policy for millennia. Maybe both are true. Maybe Malcador was both monster and hero, manipulator and martyr. Maybe the same man who tortured an Eldar hybrid 300 times for his own emotional comfort also genuinely sacrificed everything to give humanity one more chance at survival. Maybe redemption isn't about becoming good, it's about choosing, in that final moment, to do the right thing even though you're still the same monster you've always been. And maybe that's what Malcador meant when he told Jagadai Khan that even the greatest monsters could be redeemed and forgiven. Not that they stop being monsters, but that they can still choose to do something heroic, even if it's just once, even if it's the last thing they ever do. So let me bring this all together because I know we've covered a lot of dark ground. Malcador the Sigillite, probably actually Brahm al-Khadour, a Perpetual who committed atrocities during Old Night, met a powerful warlord and convinced him to become an emperor. Together they unified Terra, launched the Great Crusade, and built the foundation of the Imperium. Malcador handled the subtle work: administration, manipulation, institution building, assassination. The Emperor handled the obvious work: conquest, genetic engineering, psychic mastery. The Primarchs were never meant to last. Like the Thunder Warriors before them, they were tools, powerful, dangerous tools that had to be eliminated once their purpose was served. But they couldn't just be executed. That would be too obvious, too likely to turn the legions against the Emperor, so instead they were manipulated from the moment of their rediscovery, positioned, set against each other, given just enough resentment and just enough cause that when the right trigger came along, chaos, corruption, they'd tear each other apart. The plan was for a controlled purge: remove the unstable ones, keep the reliable ones, let humanity emerge as the dominant force with any remaining Primarchs as carefully managed guardians rather than potential tyrants. But chaos sensed the manipulation and pushed early. The heresy came before they were ready, before they could control who fell and who stayed loyal. Instead of a surgical strike, they got a total civil war. Malcador knew all of this. He confessed it to Sibel Niasta as she died, framed as a comforting lie and probably closer to the truth than anyone wants to admit. He also confessed it to Ael Wyntor, along with the secrets about all the wars to come afterwards. Those confessions were so terrible that Wyntor killed himself 300 times trying to escape the knowledge. An elder consciousness broken by human crimes over and over again. And through it all, Malcador was building the Administratum to manage Terra, the Inquisition to hunt heresy, the Grey Knights to fight demons, control over the assassins to eliminate threats, structures that would outlast both him and the Emperor, systems designed to keep humanity grinding forward no matter what, even if the Emperor himself was removed from play. When the Emperor was shattered in his fight with Horus, when he had to be replaced on the Golden Throne just to survive, Malcador took his place temporarily. The Emperor declared him Malcador the hero, and the Sigillite died holding back the forces of chaos, his body turning to dust but his soul persevering through sheer force of will, until his oldest friend could take the burden back. But his institutions remained, his chosen remained, his system remained. And 10,000 years later, the Imperium still runs on Malcadorian principles. Was he a loyal servant who made terrible but necessary choices? Was he a monster who found redemption in sacrifice? Or was he something in between? An ancient being who had committed so many atrocities that one final heroic act couldn't possibly balance the scales, but who tried anyway because even monsters can hope for forgiveness? The answer probably lies somewhere in all that. Humans aren't usually pure good or pure evil. They're complicated, contradictory, capable of both horrible cruelty and genuine compassion. But Perpetuals? Beings who lived through millennia of human history, who've had to make impossible choices over and over again, until those choices stop feeling impossible. I'm not sure the normal human framework applies anymore. Maybe Malcador really did believe he was serving humanity. Maybe every manipulation, every atrocity, every engineered betrayal was genuinely done with humanity's best interest at heart. Maybe he looked at the Primarchs and saw not suns but weapons that would inevitably turn on their wielder, and decided that controlling the timing of that turn was the only way to survive it. Or maybe he was exactly what Horus claimed, a cursed wanderer who spent all night committing crimes he would never wash away, and spent the rest of his existence trying to justify those crimes by building something that would make them worthwhile. Maybe the Imperium isn't humanity's salvation. Maybe it's Malcador's monument to his own survival. Proof that he can turn even the worst atrocities into something that looks like civilization if he's just patient enough. We'll never know for sure. Malcador took his secrets with him when he died on the Golden Throne. Or did he? Because fragments of him live on in the throne itself and in his chosen. The Inquisition still operates on his principles. The Grey Knights still follow his teachings. The Imperium still grinds forward on the structures he built. Maybe that's the real immortality, not living forever yourself, but building something that will keep your vision alive long after you're gone. And if that's true, then Brahm al-Khadour, the cursed wanderer, the monster who committed atrocities during Old Night, the Sigillite who manipulated Primarchs like chess pieces, the hero who died holding back chaos didn't die at all, he just changed forms. From man to system, from person to institution. From Malcador the Sigillite to Malcador the Imperium itself. And if that's not the most Warhammer 40K thing you've ever heard, I don't know what is. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, even your saviors are monsters. And sometimes the greatest tyranny is the one that convinces you it's necessary for survival. And sometimes the only difference between a villain and a hero is which side of the story you're telling. So the next time you hear about the Emperor protecting, about his grand plan, about how the Imperium is humanity's last hope against chaos, remember Malcador. Remember the man who built the machine. Remember that someone had to position all those pieces on the board. Someone had to engineer all those betrayals. And ask yourself, if the greatest monsters can be redeemed and forgiven, as Malcador said, does that mean they ever stopped being monsters? Or does it just mean they found a cause that makes their monstrosity look like heroism? Because I'm starting to think the difference between a tyrant and a savior isn't what they do. It's just how good they are at making you believe you chose to serve them. And Malcador the Sigillite, Malcador the hero, Brahm al-Khadour the cursed wanderer, he was very, very good at it.